Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. Her name is Kimberly K. Hoang. Her last name is spelled Hoang, and she just published a book, September 6, 2022. Title of the book is Spiderweb Capitalism: How Global Elites Exploit Frontier Markets. And we were talking kind of in the pre-show. I just had Hal Weitzman on. Last month, we talked about all the kind of subterranean, maybe sketchy things involved in Delaware's kind of corporate environment. But I think this book fits in as a great kind of follow-on to that discussion, because it's about some dealings that maybe not as well known to the public. But this is not Kimberly's first book. She also published back in 2014 a book titled Human Trafficking Reconsidered: Rethinking the Problem, Envisioning New Solutions. And then also in 2015, Dealing in Desire: Asian Ascendancy, Western Decline, and the Hidden Currencies of Global Sex Work. And Kimberly Hoang is an associate professor of sociology at the College of the University of Chicago. She's the author of the books that I just mentioned. She's also had articles that have appeared in American Sociological Review, Social Problems, Gender and Society, Contexts, the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography and Sexualities, as well as articles for the BBC. And her homepage, her website, is her full name. So it's KimberlyKHoang.com. And I'll put that in the show notes, as long as her Twitter handle. So if you have any questions about the book or any follow-on questions, you can reach out to her at Kimberly K. Hoang. But again, the book we're going to talk about today, just published September 6, 2022, is Spiderweb Capitalism: How Global Elites Exploit Frontier Markets. So Kimberly K. Hoang, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So for people who may not have heard your name or your earlier work, can you talk about your background and your academic career and what led you to write and put together this book, Spiderweb Capitalism?
Sure. So I'm a sociologist by training. I received my PhD in 2011 from UC Berkeley sociology program. And, I think the story of Spiderweb Capitalism emerged in somewhat of an organic way from my first book, monograph book, Dealing in Desire. The first book, Dealing in Desire, is a book about the sex industry in Vietnam. And it's a story about how the sex industry facilitates foreign direct investment into the country, particularly FDI coming in from other more developed nations in East and Southeast Asia. So South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, China, Taiwan, Malaysia, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a time of the 2008 financial crisis. And the story is really about how foreign investment was coming primarily from East and Southeast Asian nations, with a very Asian style of deal brokering that was on the basis of trust and a handshake, and in a context where legal contracts were not as, didn't have much teeth to them, or where the legal structure wasn't, very sophisticated, and where there was widespread corruption. And so that book was published in 2015, and there were some questions that were unanswered in that book because I was doing an ethnography. I was an ethnographer doing an ethnography inside of hostess bars. And so I was really curious, what happens outside of hostess bars, and more curious how, Western businessmen who are constrained by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act do business differently in this context than businessmen, say, from South Korea or China, who are not constrained by the same global laws around corruption. So, it starts with a very simple story. I go to Vietnam and Myanmar as the two sites that I'm really interested in studying, Myanmar being an even newer frontier that people were sort of chasing after at the time when Aung San Suu Kyi was elected, into office at that time. And so I kind of go there and I'm doing some interviews, and I realize that, oh my goodness, all of these investments are managed offshore, and they're managed through offshore vehicles that are set up in Hong Kong and Singapore. And so I start to ask for the contact information of lawyers, company secretaries, accountants, bankers, all of the people that are managing these investment vehicles offshore, and I go to Hong Kong and Singapore and carry out some of the interviews. And I realized that those are just subsidiaries of other entities based in the British Virgin Islands, Seychelles, Panama, et cetera, et cetera. And so I kind of stumble into the story of Spiderweb Capitalism, which is a story of offshoring. And it's a story of how these investments they never go direct from nation A to nation B, but instead are entangled in this 3D web, capital web, where there are a ton of different financial professionals who help to move money around the world through these different offshore vehicles.
Right, and you break that down into two different there's really the chairman and the other ones, the HNMIs and the UHNWIs. Can you explain those acronyms for the listener?
Sure. So, when I started to do this book as a sociologist, there was a time when sociologists were really interested, and I think economists too, in the study of elites. And in the study of elites, and this is, post 2008, everyone was looking at the 1%ers, or the 1% versus 99%. And what I realized is that actually many of the people that I study are part of the 1%, but we don't differentiate. And there's a big difference between the 1% and the 0.001%, for example. And so the way that I sort of theorize spiderweb capitalism is that these webs are social webs, and so I kind of take an analogy of social spiders, where they build out these massive webs together in community. But what I do is I differentiate between what I call big spiders and smaller spiders. So the big spiders are ultra high net worth individuals, and the smaller spiders are the high net worth individuals who sort of manage the investments or manage the money on behalf of the ultra high net worth individuals. So high net worth individuals are basically highly compensated financial professionals who kind of carry out the footwork and the investments on behalf of the ultra high net worth individuals, who are often invisible in these complex webs. And the high net worth individuals are the people who are often the fall people and in the face of the deal when something goes wrong.
Right. So you have this kind of breaking down. So the kind of lower people are like the managers, fund managers, accountants, lawyers, bankers, and they actually have fixers too. So there's kind of this people facilitating the investment into these frontier markets, correct?
Yes. Yes.
And you had concerns about the foreign corrupt while you were investigating all this material, the spiderweb capitalism. You had some concerns about the FCPA too, right? You had to get that checked out. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so as an American researcher, I learned that I could not. And particularly as an ethnographer, I think I really love Hal Weitzman's book, who you mentioned, "What's the Matter with Delaware?" And I think I just will say, Hal Weitzman's method of research is very different from mine, in that he's looking at court cases, newspaper articles, interviewing people and putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Most of what I do is interviewing people and ethnography, which is following people around to try to see them in action. And most ethnography as a method has been used to study down. It's used to study, sex workers, like I did for my first book, gang members, like many people do coming out of the Chicago School of Sociology, and it's not really been used very much to study elites or to study up, as we call it. But what I ran into was that, per the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I could not witness any people carrying out bribes or any of these transactions in person. I couldn't really look at the multiple books that people had for their accounting, because that technically would make me an accessory to criminal activity. And so the way that I sort of got around that was that I would follow people and travel with people, but I wouldn't necessarily sit in with them on the meetings, but I would have breakfast and drinks with, breakfast beforehand, coffee afterwards, drinks afterwards, and try to get them to fill me in on what was happening inside. And oftentimes when you travel with people or you spend a lot of time with people, you build trust and they let their guard down, and they are much more open to kind of what's happening with these transactions, what are some of the complicated things going on. And so I was, if I was not a US researcher, I don't think I would be constrained in the same ways as US investors were. But it definitely, created barriers to the research that I think I would have been able to go deeper and see things much more firsthand if I wasn't similarly constrained by the FCPA.
Right. So, but those were serious concerns, because a lot of that stuff you talk about that in your book about the corruption or these relationships between people that may not be as firmly memorialized in a contract. But can you kind of also talk about all the, like, you were there for 18 months and these two things, you traveled frequently. Can you talk about the people you met and how you accrued all that ethnographic information?
Yeah, so most of the people that I met, I started out, primarily interviewing fund managers and the people who work in their offices. So lawyers, accountants, company secretaries, the people who work in with them, both in their offices, but also who they contract out to do some of this work. And then I, through them, started to meet the people who they were courting. So, and those tended to be more of the ultra high net worth individuals whose money is really all around the world, and who they were looking to attract investment into these new frontiers. And I will say that it's a little bit of, going at it at two ends, because at this time, investments in the US and in this context were often seen as safe, where you can, generally see returns of, 5 to 7%. And the return on investment that you're seeing in these new frontiers was so high. I mean, so many people were really interested in emerging markets, frontier markets. And with the exposure to China, people were looking for newer markets like Vietnam. And those that were in Vietnam were looking for even newer frontiers going to Myanmar. And so there was sort of this matchmaking process of, folks from all around the world looking to, get exposure to or get access to these new frontiers, while at the same time you have fund managers on the ground that are looking to raise capital for investment projects in these frontiers. And so I started by interviewing, just anyone who was willing to talk to me about their role in facilitating the movement of capital. I was really interested in how people shape markets, particularly markets that are new, that have weak legal institutions, where corruption is generally widespread, where relationships matter a lot. And so I was really interested in sort of how people broker deals. And what I came to understand is that, people have a whole network of people working on various deals for them. And I was really interested in, okay, what do each of the different people do? The lawyers, the company secretaries, the fund managers, what role do they play in helping to facilitate the movement of capital into these markets? And how do they sort of facilitate the movement of capital out or profits out? Which, what I learned is that oftentimes the investment is made offshore, and money only comes in onshore to cover the costs of operations. But a lot of the deals are set up, completely offshore in Singapore, Hong Kong, and then in the British Virgin Islands, Panama, Seychelles, so forth.
Right. So there's this whole process. You have a section in the introductory chapters about how this offshore investment connects to onshore vehicles. There's this whole process, roadshows. Can you talk about how that works?
Yeah. So, I mean, most of the process is, I would say that one thing I will say is that when people talk about offshore, and I think, when you hear it through Hal Weitzman's lens, there is kind of a dirty, we often think of secrecy, corruption, and all of that. And what I want to be clear about is that, yes, that is all true in there. But at the same time, when you're talking about less developed economies where there's not a lot of faith in the state or in the banking or financial institutions, offshore is also a way to protect much of these, to protect these investments. And so the state is, I think in many ways fully aware that the only way that they can attract foreign capital is by allowing for these structures to be set up offshore. So part of what Spiderweb capitalism is it's really theorizing how investors play in the gray. And what playing in the gray means is how they sort of play in the space between what is legal or illegal, licit, illicit, corrupt, clean. And the argument is that we kind of think of these as binaries when in fact they occur along a continuum, and people in these kind of markets are often playing in the gray. However, when I talk about these structures, it's often not the ultra high net worth individuals who are kind of doing this dirty work. They sort of have people or employ people who carry out this footwork on their behalf, and those are highly compensated financial professionals who carry out these investments, oversee these investments, and are often the face of the deals. But ironically, they take home a very small percent of the profit margins on the deals, while also assuming a great deal of risk. And the reason why they're willing to do that is because they still are part of, the top 90% of, wealth income, worldwide. And so it's worth taking the risk for them, because I think the dream or the goal is ultimately to become, or to grow to become, ultra high net worth individuals. And that is something that they imagine as more possible in new frontier markets where the risk is higher, but also the return on investment is also higher when things go well.
Right. And you mentioned C. Wright Mills and the power elite. And how does his kind of insights, you reference him as a very important influence upon you. How does he play into your inquiry into Spiderweb Capitalism?
Yeah, I was very inspired by C. Wright Mills because I would say that, C. Wright Mills really is one of the first sort of leading sociologists who thinks about the relationship between political and economic elites, and the ways in which political and economic elites work together in order to they sort of like work in concert with each other. And I think that, in the U.S. side, we often think of political elites as the political sphere as separate from the economic sphere, where the political sphere is regulating the economic sphere. There's these systems of checks and balances. And in less developed economies, it's the, political elites who enable economic elites to sort of make their money via inside access to deals, particularly state-owned enterprise, ones that are governed by state-owned enterprises, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I really liked about going back to C. Wright Mills really was the ways in which he talks about how political elites essentially provide the legal runway for economic elites to lift off of. And it's sort of, and this is where playing in the gray is really important. It's just sort of how people are able to legally, make their money in this very legal, in a very legal fashion with the help of political elites. And so, and in new frontier markets, that's really, it's not just the legal structure. When it's legal, it's not just that there's a sort of legal runway to take off on. But it's also in an informal context, it's the spaces where there may be laws in place, but those laws are not necessarily enforced or heavily regulated.
Right. So there's a lot of other kind of shady things. And it's an academic book, but you have a lot of first-person stories of these individuals. You've used, pseudonyms, but these players have shared their systems, and you talk about Fritz and Ross in the beginning. You talk about some of these other. Can you talk about some of the interesting characters you met and how they play into this whole frontier market capitalism?
Yeah, I think that as a sociologist, I'm just very interested in people and who are the people behind these deals and how do they make money move. And Fritz and Ross are people that I introduce in chapter 1 of the book, and I think they're very interesting people because Fritz is a 40-year-old U.S. citizen who has spent a lot of time in Asia. And he travels back and forth between Seattle, Hong Kong, Vietnam, and Myanmar, and is based in Hong Kong. but oversees basically the firm's investments in Vietnam and Myanmar. And, he makes a base salary of around $300,000 a year, and an additional bonus. And so he is what I would call a, high net worth individual. And when I met Fritz, I thought, oh, he's the guy. It's the fund. He's managing this big fund. And he said to me, oh, no, actually, Ross it's all Ross's money, and most of it is Ross's money. And he explains to me that the fund in total has $250 million. 50 million comes from the small guys like Fritz, but Ross is the one who brought $200 million to the fund. And so he's really managing, in the way he sees it, he's really managing Ross's money and making decisions about where to invest in Vietnam and Myanmar. That's sort of his mandate. But Ross's money is invested, pretty much all over the world. They have investment mandates for Russia, Africa, Ukraine, Southeast Asia. And the Southeast Asia Fund is the one that Fritz manages. And so I think that this is really a story about how all of these investments and people are connected to one another, where, and you can see through this one example, a simplified example of this type of 3D web.
Right. And so you have like this group, the high network, the lower level people doing it. But there's also, it has that frontier Wild West connection to it, because you mentioned some terms I didn't expect to see in here, like greasers, fixers. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of talk about how some of these transactions are facilitated that are not in conformance with Western, legal standards?
It's really interesting that you asked me that, because at the time that I was doing this research, I came on fixers. And so fixers are, in this context, are people who are primarily in charge of handling the bribes on behalf of investors. And fixers, oftentimes also handle these bribes on behalf of the high net worth individuals, not just the ultra high net worth individuals. And so these are the people who, bribe judges in lawsuits. They're the people who have basically relationships to the right key officials, and can anticipate problems, can ensure, licensing, and permits will go through. So they're fixers at all different levels, I would say, right? And there's, fixers who do small things and fixers who do very big things, depending on the investment and size of deal. And there's all different types that I go through in the book, later on in the book. And I think what's really interesting is that in this market, and people would say this about China too, which is that anytime a foreign investor wants to go into these markets, they have to have a local partner. And the reason why a local partner is important, not just for communication or cultural reasons, is because the local partner usually has a relationship with state officials in order to get things done. And it's not really actually the local partner that has those relationships. It's a local partner who has a fixer. And so there's all of these different degrees of separation that, keeps the ultra high and high net worth individuals sort of, it creates these legal firewalls, because they're not the ones that are carrying out the bribes. It's the fixer that's doing it. And what I think is so interesting about the way that you frame the question is that under the Trump administration, we start to see the word fixer all over the media and all over the news, right? We see that with Michael Cohen. It was just the word fixer. We see fixers with Russia, Ukraine, and the relationships under the Trump administration, and Epstein. I mean, I think of Epstein as a fixer in the U.S. context in some ways, right? Or a type of, there are many different types of fixers. And so what I really like about Hal Weitzman's book, What's the Matter with Delaware, is that he really takes this back to the US. And so I allude to it at the end of my book, where I say, we often think of this as something that happens over there in third world economies, but Spiderweb Capitalism is a story about how these new frontier markets are actually interconnected into a web that's connected to very developed economies in the US. And actually fixers is not something that exists just somewhere over there in some faraway place like Vietnam or Myanmar. They exist here in the United States, and in fact, their role in many ways, they're modeled after fixers in more developed economies. And many of these deals that are sort of, frontier market deals of front running the legal system and front running the law are also modeled after, what happened in the U.S. before regulations were put in place. And so it's almost like they're trying to front run the regulators or be two steps ahead of the regulators by moving to new emerging markets or new frontiers where those laws are not yet put in place.
Really interesting, right? And that's why the FCPA was put in place. And so then you just go to these newer markets, Myanmar, and these. Can you talk about the rapid change that's happened in at least those two markets in Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Myanmar?
I think that Vietnam, so at the time that I was doing the research, everyone thought that Myanmar was going to leapfrog Vietnam in terms of foreign investment, primarily because Myanmar is an English-speaking country. It is, set up with a legal infrastructure that's very similar to, common law, British common law. Whereas, Vietnam was much more complicated. It's a socialist market transitioning to a capitalist market, a capitalist market-based economy, but still under a socialist, government. And so there was this sense at the time. I think that after the coup, a lot of stuff in Myanmar has, stopped, slowed down, or has come to a halt, and everybody's kind of waiting to see. But Vietnam is an incredible story. It's an incredibly dynamic economy. It's grown, tremendously. Even from the time of my first book to my second book, the economy is incredibly dynamic. It's grown so rapidly. You now have, billionaires in Vietnam that didn't exist there in years prior. So this idea of smaller spiders, having a vision of growing to becoming ultra high net worth individuals, I think you're there already. You've seen that there now, and there are ultra high net worth individuals in Vietnam now who are, have investments all over the world too. And so I think it's a market and it's an economy that more people, especially with China closing up and everything that's happening in Hong Kong, seem to have, to me, a much greater appetite for Vietnam.
Interesting. And what's your kind of take on the impact of this external capital on these frontier markets as far as sociologically or ethnographically? Do you have a multivariate view, positive, negative? What are your thoughts?
I think I have a very, multi-layered view. And I think I think of it as a kaleidoscope, and when you shift this kaleidoscope and look at it through various lenses, you have different views. So I think, when I look at it through a lens of, post-war economy, following the Vietnam War, it's almost sort of like you could see this as the rise and revenge of Vietnam, not just in terms of the, geopolitical way, but in terms of, its economic rise. I think that, as a Vietnamese American who comes from a refugee family, I remember, returning to Vietnam in the 90s when it was, primarily, thatched huts, and, you could see the ways in which the economy was devastated by the war. And if you go to Bangkok, you just think, wow, Bangkok was 20 years ahead of Ho Chi Minh City. And, this is what happens when a country goes through a war. And within a very short time, I would say that Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh City in particular is just, bypassed, Jakarta in Indonesia, Bangkok in Thailand. Like, everyone is just, it's rapid. And I think most people look at that dynamism and that rapid growth in positive ways. Of course, the sociologist in me says, look, there's winners and losers. And of course, the people that win are winning big in Vietnam. And then there are people that get left behind, land dispossession and all of that. For my first book, I definitely studied down, and I think I would have a better picture of the unintended consequences of these capital flows. But I really have, for Spiderweb Capitalism, have kind of left that to other sociologists and anthropologists to study, because this book I was really interested mostly in elites and mostly in, how they make deals. I will say that there are some stories that I have towards the end of the book that I don't want to go so deep into of, a group of people that were protesting, because they were, they felt like their land was dispossessed and they were not paid fairly for their land. And so I do think that whenever you have this kind of rapid development, there are inevitably going to be people that lose from this and people that win hugely. On the whole, though, most people would say that this kind of rapid economic development has been good because the GDP has risen. It's you just watching a country really go from frontier to becoming an emerging market.
Right, it is fascinating. I have family members who visited Vietnam, and they were like, "This is, it felt like a first world country." Some of the travel areas and things like that. So it really is remarkable. Kimberly, we're at the 30-minute mark. Is there anything you'd like to add? Or, there's a lot more information in this book. We've covered kind of the introductory stuff. We haven't talked about impunity, tax strategies. What would you like to add, or anything I missed before we wrap this up?
I think that, it's interesting that I guess just riffing off of, I was listening to one of your podcasts around Jeffrey Epstein, and it just, I think riffing off of some of your own interests, it just made me think about how, we live in a global world where deal brokering is largely done between political and economic elites, and often through, trust is built through the labors of, and women, or having women around as accessories. And my first book, Dealing in Desire, gets into this, but I really, even with my second book, Spiderweb Capitalism, I talk about these homoerotic triangles where women are often used as props and accessories to build relationships of trust, but also to create relationships of mutual hostage or potential mutual destruction. And I think that that's something that's not, what we're seeing is it's increasingly not just unique to countries like Vietnam or Asia, but also with Trump and Epstein and all of the people that were involved in that in the U.S. We're seeing it here on the U.S. side. And I think that, riffing off of some of your other work, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about in the aftermath of this book, the other day, my husband and I watched Tinder Swindler on Netflix. And, I'm just astounded by the fact that the guy was arrested and was out of jail within 5 months. And I just think a lot about how, why is it that in the US in particular, financial crimes seem to go, they just seem to go so unregulated, or I would say like they're not criminalized in the same ways as small petty crimes.
No doubt.
And I'm not a criminologist. I don't really study the sort of criminal justice system in the same way, aside from reading the books that I think the general public is reading, like Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. But when I think about that book, I juxtapose to my book, and up next to what Hal Weitzman studies in his book, What's the Matter with Delaware, I can't help but wonder, if Spiderweb, part of my argument is that, with Spiderweb capitalism, you have these systems that are very hard to take down, in part because they're not criminalized in the same way that we have, this massive industrial prison complex around. And I just, I guess I would put the question back on you, looking at, the Epstein case, looking at other kinds of financial crimes. What do you think, or why do you think it is that things like, people, the Tinder swindler guy and some of the people that I study largely either fly under the radar, or even when they are caught, really don't have serious consequences compared to other types of crimes that we see out there?
I think that's a great question. I think it's something about this kind of new globalization environment where some of these new crimes are taking place transnationally, transjurisdictionally. So the severity doesn't seem to be the same as it was within a particular jurisdiction. But I totally see the similarities between these homoerotic, homosocial bonding things. It's probably, you could call it pedosocial in Epstein's case. Not all the time, but the mutual hostage. Yeah. That's why though everybody's quiet about Epstein, because a lot of those people got in that same relationship, not in a frontier market capitalism, but in some ways you could say that's a frontier, sociological environment, whatever went down at that island or whatever was going on with Epstein. There are definitely similarities there, but I don't know. There's a lot of politicization of the law, I think, involved, which is why some of these people get away with light sentences and some don't. Like Epstein got a very light sentence back in 2008. So there's a lot of questions there. There's a lot of questions that add on why. And I think that there are different frontiers. So there's a frontier in Vietnam and Myanmar, but there's frontiers in all over the world that people aren't seeing whatever's going on in the Virgin Islands or maybe some of these other places where a lot of sketchy things happened in Venezuela. So there's definitely inequality, like you mentioned in your book, inequality between the actors of these wealthy, powerful people and the people who are not in that 1%. So that would be my thing. So great book, really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. So where's the best place to get Spiderweb Capitalism? Princeton University Press website, but also it will be available on Amazon, which I think is a place many people are shopping. I saw it at Target. I saw it listed at Target. So I think, Amazon, Princeton University Press's website. I hope it's out there in many places. I think it will be. And then the best place to contact you is either Twitter or your website, www.kimberlykhoang.com, right? Yes. And so if anybody wants to ask you questions, they can find out there. Do you sell copies of your books through your website? I do not sell copies of my book through my website, but there are links on my website for where to get them. Gotcha. Cool. And great book. Really highly recommended. Again, title of it is Spiderweb Capitalism, How Global Elites Exploit Frontier Markets. And the author is Kimberly K. Hoang. Book published September 6th, 2022. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for having me on your show. Awesome. Stay there.